We are in the middle of harvest season, which means most every afternoon we are out harvesting something, whether it's carrots, beets, beans, grapes, apples, or potatoes to store away for the year ahead. By the time we finish, it's usually dinner time and everyone is tired and ready to eat. So in order to still eat healthy meals during this full season, I rely heavily on easy one-pot slow cooker meals. How this usually works for us is that in the morning, after doing chores and everyone's had breakfast, there's usually a little bit of a lull time before we get started with our morning routine, our homeschool routine. And so the kids do the dishes and practice violin, which gives me a little bit of time to get something started slow cooking. The first meal we're having this week is a creamy sausage and potato soup. Even though it's still in the 80s on our farmstead this week, my body is so ready for fall. I want to put on those cozy sweaters and jeans, but we are still in shorts and tank tops. I'm also really craving the seasonal shifts in our food. So even though it's still really warm outside, I'm starting to want things like soups and stews again. Soups are the perfect food in my opinion. They are so nourishing, economical, and can easily feed a crowd. I also love how flexible soup recipes are, and I always adapt them to use the things that we have on hand from what we've grown here on our homestead. For this soup, I start by chopping up a couple of garlic cloves, an onion, and carrots, which is basically the same way that I start making any soup. I need to get the sausage cooked first, so I'll saute that in the same Dutch oven that I'm going to use to cook the rest of the soup. That way I don't need to dirty another dish. So after I finish sauteing that, I'm going to set it aside and I'll saute the onions and the garlic and the carrots in that same pan. After a minute or two, I add in a 1/4 cup of tapioca starch. So this is to make a roux and give the soup a nice creamy texture. You could also use regular flour here too. We just like to use tapioca starch or arrowroot starch because they make great thickeners and they're a good gluten-free substitute. Once the flour is stirred in and you can't see any more white, I slowly and incrementally add in some chicken broth, stirring it as I go. And you'll really want to get in there with a spatula or a wooden spoon to deglaze the pan or loosen up any food that got stuck to the bottom of the pan. I'm going to let that simmer on low heat so I can go chop up my potatoes. So for making a potato soup, it's best to use red or yellow potatoes because they're going to hold their shape better than a white potato or a russet potatoes that could easily turn into mush in the potato soup. Before adding the potatoes back to the pan with the rest of the soup ingredients, I pour in around 2 cups of whole milk to the soup. You could also add cream here instead to make an extra rich and creamy soup. I'll link the full recipe below with all of the exact amounts and instructions that you need. Now is also the time when you're going to want to add your spices. So I'm just adding some salt, pepper, Italian seasoning, and then some dried nettle that we had preserved earlier this year. Instead of the nettle, you could always use some finely chopped fresh kale to give your soup that extra pop of color and some added nutrients. Or you could just omit the greens altogether. After everything is stirred together, it's time to add your sausage back in. I'm using a mild Italian sausage here, but you could use whatever kind you like. And from here, as far as slow cooking goes, you have a few different options. So our oven is unique in that it's always on, so it's always hot, and each oven compartment is set at a different temperature. So one of the compartments is set at 200 or 250, and we call it our slow cooking oven. And so it's always at that temperature, which is the perfect temperature for slow cooking. So I'm just gonna pop my Dutch oven right in that compartment and let it cook for the next several hours. You could also do the same thing by transferring your soup to an actual crock pot and cook it there, or you could just keep it simmering on the stove on low heat until the potatoes are nice and soft and you're ready to eat. Just make sure you keep stirring it occasionally so nothing gets burnt on the bottom of the pan. The great thing about all of the meals that I'm making this week is that they'll all serve us twice. I know some people aren't a fan of leftovers, but I love them and rely heavily on them. It makes my life so much easier to cook once and have that food feed us twice. Another regular part of our days right now, alongside harvesting, is preserving. So many of the foods that we're harvesting, like potatoes and carrots, winter squash, they'll store just fine as is, but other things like grapes and a good amount of the apples will need to be preserved to last us for the year ahead. Our family goes through around a quart of applesauce most weeks, so I'm trying to preserve somewhere around 40 to 50 quarts of applesauce this fall. Because we grow most of our own apples and don't spray at all, I like to leave the skins on the apples for all that goodness, that extra fiber, antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals that they provide. So before I go to bed, I'll core the apples and toss them in a large Dutch oven. Before we had this oven, I would just do this in a large crock pot. I don't add anything else. I just throw in the apples and slow cook them on low all night while we're sleeping. Hey. What is your... In the morning then, all you need to do is scoop out those cooked apples and blend them into a smooth sauce. I like to add a little bit of salt and cinnamon as well for flavor. It's helpful to use a high power blender here like a Vitamix or a food processor to make sure that all your peels are completely blended up. If you use something like an immersion blender, you'll probably be left with some gritty peels in your applesauce. That's the apples. Doesn't it smell so good?
And this one's smells like a...
Maybe we'll have some licks here in a minute.
It smells like apples.
Then I can them in small batches, just 3 or 4 jars at a time, but I'm canning something almost every day.
Let's go.
Alright, anyone want some applesauce licks?
Me. Is it hot?
This past week, we went and picked up the meat from the whole cow that we had processed. My favorite thing about getting our meat this way, by the whole animal, or it could be a quarter or half an animal, is that you get all of the cuts of meat. And when you only purchase kind of the standard cuts at the grocery store, you know, the roast and the steaks and the ground meat, you miss out on so much. Not only is this a more economical and ethical way to purchase meat, but it's also more nutritious. So many of those less common cuts are actually the most nutrient dense with all of the good collagen and gelatin, extra vitamins and minerals. One of my favorite cuts are beef short ribs, which are made to be cooked low and slow. When cooked slowly, the collagen in the ribs breaks down into gelatin, which makes them super tender and melt in your mouth. I cut the meat into individual ribs between each of the bones and then place them in a single layer bone side up after sprinkling them with salt and a little bit of pepper. I like to broil the short ribs for just a few minutes and then flip them over and broil them on the other side for a few minutes. And this does essentially the same thing as searing a roast before you cook it. It helps to add a depth of flavor to the final dish. I usually make barbecue beef short ribs by adding a barbecue sauce over the ribs and then slow cooking, but today I wanted to try making Korean short ribs. Over the weekend, I did a little batch cooking to get us set up for the week. So along with cooking and pulling the meat off of a whole chicken and making broth for easy lunches and soaking and cooking some beans, the other thing that I made was a big batch of rice that will go with these short ribs. I shared this on a different video several weeks back, but I like to make rice in advance because cooling starchy foods like rice or mashed potatoes in the fridge after cooking them helps to lower the glycemic index and not spike your blood sugar so much. It's just one of those hacks that it's like, why not do it? Most recipes that I found for Korean short ribs call for adding a whole cup of brown sugar in the sauce, and I wanted to avoid doing that. So instead I'm going to blend in a whole apple with a few garlic cloves, some ground ginger, a splash of apple cider vinegar, and about a half a cup of coconut aminos, which are a soy sauce alternative. From here, after the short ribs are broiled, you could transfer them to your slow cooker and either cook them on low all day, or you could cook them on high for about 4 hours, or you could cook them in your oven. So I ended up cooking them in our oven at around 275 or 300 for about 4 hours. Short ribs are definitely a fattier cut of meat, so before serving I like to remove the meat and then ladle off some of the fat before adding the sauce back with the short ribs to serve them. And I just reserve this fat in a jar that I'll use later for cooking. This is also why we love serving short ribs with rice, because the rice just kind of absorbs some of that, and our kids don't usually love the fattier pieces of meat, but they really are a big fan of short ribs when they're served this way. These are also a great one to make ahead and then reheat. And really the thing about all of these slow cooked meals is that I think they even taste better when they're reheated. The flavors have had a chance to meld together and they just get better and better after a few days. We try really hard to guard our evenings because we really value dinner together as well as our after dinner family read aloud time before bed. But as our kids have gotten older, this has gotten a little bit more challenging. So right now we have Awana one night a week and then ballet another evening, but having these slow cooker meals ready whenever we need to eat definitely helps to make those busier nights go more smoothly. The other meal we are eating this week is a slow-cooked steak chili. One of the cuts of meat that we always get with our cow are round steaks. Round steaks are really lean cuts of beef, so slow cooking is perfect for them to help make them nice and tender. They're also boneless, so it's really easy to cut them up in cubes to add to your chili. Round steak also tends to be a less expensive cut of meat if you are purchasing it from the store or your local butcher. And of course, you could always use ground beef or ground meat in your chili, but I do really like the added richness that comes from using steak in chili. Chili really is a perfect slow cooker meal because besides sauteing the garlic and the onion, peppers if you're using them, and browning the meat, it's basically a dump and cook sort of meal that's completely hands-off. We like a really thick, hearty chili, so I use a whole quart of roasted tomato sauce and then add some starchy vegetables like carrots, sweet potatoes, or butternut squash to our chili, along with the beans, meat, and then the other vegetables like your garlic and your onion. And depending on how thick it's seeming, I'll often add a cup or two of extra broth, or in this case we're adding a little bit of whey left over from the farmhouse cheddar cheese that Jim had made yesterday, just to thin it out a little bit. I'm going to get everything slow cooking in the oven, and we're going to cook this all day and have it for dinner later. Just throw everything in that slow cooker and cook it either on low all day or on high for 3 to 4 hours. Chili is also such a great food that uses up so many extras from the garden, and the leftovers can be used in so many ways. So we'll often eat it the first time as just a regular bowl of chili with some cheese and some sour cream, but then we'll use the leftovers as a topping for baked potatoes or sweet potatoes, or as a filling in our enchilada casserole. When I think about the food that we eat and what I make for our family, I often think back to how our ancestors would have eaten, and I picture this pot of stew, slow cooking over a fire, with whatever they would have hunted, or foraged for, or harvested, and I think they were really onto something. From both a convenience standpoint as well as nutritionally, slow cooking offers so many benefits and has really shaped how we feed our family, especially in these fall and winter months.